we're going to be talking to Professor Norman Finklestein, an American citizen, a man of considerable note, a man known throughout the world as a fearless intellectual who has faced many trials and tribulations for the courage that he has shown. It's not exaggerating to say he's a kind of Jeremy Corbyn figure in that regard. He has been smeared and slandered and subject to all kinds of harassment and loss of tenure and loss of work and so on, because he speaks up in his own tradition for justice and for truth. Now, Norman Finklestein doesn't normally get involved in British politics, but he got involved in the Margaret Hodge affair in a very small vignette on YouTube that I saw, which actually moved me to tears. And I'm not a man easily moved to tears. I hope he's with me now. Professor Norman Finklestein, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me on.
Now, you're aware, although it's not your number one interest in life, that the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, is having a very, very difficult time trying to hold the line which he has maintained all of his life, which is to defend, stand up for the Palestinian people under occupation and siege. A lot of people don't like that. How have you seen recent developments, including the frankly absurd claim by Margaret Hodge, Dame Margaret Hodge, in the last couple of days, that she more or less saying that she feels like her father must have felt in the grip of the Holocaust in Nazi Germany? What do you say to people like that?
Well, first of all, it's not correct to say that this is not a priority issue for me. It is. Jeremy Corbyn represents the prospect of a real political breakthrough in the Western world, one which will have repercussions, reverberations everywhere. And what is now happening to Jeremy Corbyn is really just a premonition, a harbinger of what's going to happen if Bernie Sanders is nominated in 2020 in the Democratic Party. It's perfectly obvious to anybody who observes that the same sorts of tactics where Bernie is going to be smeared for positions he took in the 1970s and 80s, for example, his support of the Sandinistas, and then there's going to be all sorts, Sandinistas in Nicaragua, and then there'll be all sorts of guilt by association because many supporters of Palestinian rights have rallied around Bernie Sanders. And it was already clear when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez won what became a nationwide significant victory in New York City, the first thing they tried to hang her on was statements she made about Gaza. So everything that's now happening to Corbyn is really a trial run, a prefiguration for what will happen in the U.S. if Bernie Sanders gets the nomination in 2020. So both for global reasons, the fact that his campaign can mark a significant breakthrough, a historic breakthrough for the international left, and also for domestic reasons. I'm watching very closely the crucial crucifixion of Corbyn and how to combat it, how to maneuver, and how to survive, not just survive, but survive with your principles intact. And that is a real challenge, especially as the people, many of the people surrounding Corbyn, such as the spokespeople from Momentum and some of the unions, are abandoning jettisoning their principles, and trying to reach all sorts of unprincipled and potentially destructive compromises with the forces that are now arrayed against Corbyn. And so it's a matter of great interest to me, and I just hope that Corbyn himself displays wisdom and principle, especially as the people around him seem one by one like dominoes falling. There was a breakthrough yesterday when the barking Yenta, Dame Hodge, once again stuck her foot in her mouth. But this time, people had enough already from this barking Yenta, or the Yenta from barking, and are now fighting back. And they're fighting back with what, in my opinion, is the most powerful of all political weapons. Namely, rather than trying to factually refute this barrage, this torrent of despicable lies, they're trying a new tack now, which is just to ridicule your enemy into submission. And so, trending now in the UK on Twitter is not George Galloway, and it's not even Tom Cruise for his new movie Mission Impossible, but what's trending now is the comparisons of Hodge. And that, to me, is the perfect weapon in order to defeat these moral blackmailers and moral extortionists who are engaging in a vile, despicable campaign of conscripting the suffering of Jews during World War II, the very real martyrdom of the Jewish people during World War II, conscripting them in this extortionist blackmail campaign to try to rid Jeremy Corbyn and the principled politics he represents, to oust him, and more especially the politics he represents, from public life. That's their agenda. It has nothing whatsoever to do with a problem of anti-Semitism, which is next to near absent in British life, except among troglodytes, antediluvians, and fruitcakes. It's next to near absent in British life. It's not about anti-Semitism. It's about, in the first place, justice for Palestinians, but more broadly, it's about a principled class politics that the ruling elites in the UK, whether they be the Blairites in the Labour Party, whether they be the media elite, or whether they be the Tories, they have coalesced. There has been a convergence, and now there is this anti-Corbyn juggernaut by those who want to preserve and protect the existing order. And then there is on the other side arrayed what you might call the 99% who think that the current order needs a shaking up. It needs to be re-established anew and new, fairer and more just foundations. And that's what Corbyn represents, a new order that's waiting to be born, and his enemies are the ones who want to abort that new order, that fetus. They want to abort it, and they're using the very real suffering that Jews endured in history generally, but during the Nazi Holocaust in particular. They're exploiting it in a sordid, really sordid, filthy campaign of blackmail and extortion to try to get Corbyn on his knees, or preferably out of the party and public life altogether.
Well, these are golden words that I predict will live for a long time and travel far. Let me pick up the dichotomy you identify, first of all, that some of Corbyn's enemies are his enemies because they want to defend the existing state of affairs in Israel-Palestine, and others seek to destroy him because they fear the new order that he would be the harbinger of. And these two forces have now conflated and are together seeking to destroy the Labour Party under his leadership. Let's deal with the first part of the dichotomy first. The intervention of Netanyahu himself via Twitter. Seems that the Trump effect is catching on, and important statements are made by countries' leaders on Twitter. And Netanyahu's attack on Corbyn on Twitter this week, how significant was that for you?
Well, let's begin with the basics. Benjamin Netanyahu is an obnoxious, racist, Jewish supremacist who never for a moment hesitates to insert himself and Israeli interests in general in the domestic politics of other countries. So what you had a small taste of this past week, we had a much larger taste of when this obnoxious, racist, Jewish supremacist barged into the U.S. Capitol in defiance of and in a, let's just now call it defiance of a sitting U.S. president, and thought he had the right. He had the right, and in fact he thought he had the authority to lecture our elected U.S. Congress on the threat posed allegedly by Iran And he had the arrogance, the presumption to acquit himself as if he knew more than our State Department, our Defense Department, our CIA. He, the obnoxious, racist, Jewish supremacist, carried on as if he were more knowledgeable than the whole of our governmental system under threat posed by Iran. And he didn't think in the least awry, amiss for him to be intervening in domestic American politics. Now, what happened to Corbyn? Jewish organizations, mostly unelected, decided that from afar and from above, they were going to issue ultimatums, take it or leave it, to the Labor Party, and from afar and from above, these unelected Jewish bodies, or mostly unelected Jewish bodies, are going to dictate internal Labor Party policy in defiance of the opinions of the elected party leadership. They are doing now exactly as Netanyahu did at the time of the Iran deal in the United States. The arrogance, the presumption are really breathtaking when you add another factor. Namely, overwhelmingly, British Jews do not even support the Labour Party. It's about 15% of British Jewry votes Labour. Even when there is a Jewish candidate heading the list, as was the case with Ed Miliband in 2015, still only about 15%, if my memory is correct, only about 15% of British Jews support the Labour Party. And then you have to ask yourself a simple, and I would want to underscore, democratic question. By what right does this alien body, alien to the Labour Party, foreign to the Labour Party, by what right do these mostly unelected Jewish hoodlums, by what right do they have to dictate the internal policy of a democratically controlled party and democratically elected leadership? These are pure mafia tactics. It's the equivalent of taking out a wrench and breaking kneecaps. These are thugs. And you don't negotiate, you don't compromise with thugs. You draw a line and you say, you crossed a red line. We debated, we deliberated. We offered to consult. As Len McCluskey wrote yesterday in British HuffPost, he listed nearly a dozen, and maybe it was a dozen, compromises that Corbyn had offered. The multiple olive branches he extended to the Jewish leadership, so-called leadership. Their leadership, by the way, exactly like the Judenrats in Nazi Germany during World War II. That's the kind of leadership they are. Exactly mirror images of the Judenräte, the Jewish councils that were set up by the Nazis in World War II. That's the leadership. But he extends one olive branch, he meaning Corbyn, one olive branch, another olive branch, another olive branch, and another, and another, and another, and another olive branch. And what does he get in return? The barking Yenta, right? For those words alone, she should have been ejected from the Labour Party, not because she violated or breached any ethical code, but because...
Well, look, Professor, one last question we've only got time for. Will this end well if Jeremy Corbyn capitulates in the next week or so and agrees to all their demands? Would that be the end of it, do you think?
No, it's the beginning. They've made that clear. As the representative from the CAA said, our goal is to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn. This is only, unfortunately and alas, this is only Act 1, Scene 1 of what's going to be a protracted soap opera or tragic comedy unless Corbyn removes himself. The next...
I'll tell you what, when we get to, Professor, when we get to Act 2, as like you, I'm perfectly sure we will, it'll be good to talk to you again. Professor Norman Finklestein is the son of parents who were incarcerated in Auschwitz. Almost all of his family were massacred by actual Nazism in the Holocaust, which raged across Nazi-occupied Europe in the late 1930s and throughout the Second World War. He is a professor of significance, a figure of world authority. He says this is the crucifixion of Jeremy Corbyn.